ringing, oh, won't it be wonderful there?
So I want to get right into the lesson this evening. Our subject is on science of the Bible versus theistic evolution. So we ask this question, why not theistic evolution? Why not believe in God and believe in theistic evolution? Well, first of all, it's just scientifically wrong. And you know, that's what so many people have done, is they accept theistic evolution because they think it's scientifically right. In fact, they think the science doesn't let them believe anything other than evolution, and therefore we have to believe evolution and then just accept God and think, well, God did it in some way through this process of evolution. Now, last night we showed, I believe, some strong evidence in showing that evolution is wrong. And what we did is we went head to head, toe to toe with the evolutionists' favorite arguments. And I want to do that again tonight. I want to show you some of their favorite arguments. You'll recognize them, and let's answer them. What about the evolutionary horse series? You can't pick up a book on horses without seeing this evolutionary horse series. It's in all the introductory biology books, it's in the horse books, and it's just taken to be a fact. Well, what about it? You know, it's really not from the fossil evidence. George Gaylord Simpson, who is just a world famous evolutionist teaching at Harvard University, said, the uniform continuous transformation of hierarchical theorem, that is the little horse, into equus, so dear to the hearts of the generations of textbooks writers, never happened in nature. So this noted, famous evolutionist says, this evolution of horses, it just never happened. Bruce McFadden of the Florida Museum of Natural History said, over the years, fossil horses have been cited as a prime example of orthogenesis, and that's straight line evolution. It can no longer be considered a valid theory. We find that once a notion becomes part of accepted scientific knowledge, it is very difficult to modify or reject it. What he's saying is, this just didn't come from any of the evidence, but once evolutionists get to telling the story, if they like the story, they have a hard time not telling the story. And so they just keep telling it and putting it in the textbooks over and over again. Colin Patterson of the British Museum of Natural History said, there have been an awful lot of stories, some more imaginative than others. The most famous example is still on exhibit downstairs. It's the exhibit on horse evolution, prepared perhaps 50 years ago, that has been presented as a literal truth in textbook after textbook. Now I want you to notice, this quotation is taken from 1984. Dr. Patterson says this is still on exhibit in his own museum downstairs, and we've known better for how long? For probably the last 50 years, but it's still there. Being familiar with this quotation and using this quotation, when my wife and I, in 2013, went to the British Museum of Natural History, I got to wondering, certainly they would have taken this down. Certainly it would no longer be there. So we began to ask, we began to look for it. You know what? It's still there. Horse evolution displayed at the British Museum of Natural History. Here you see it in 2013. It's a very dimly lit room. I mean, it's really dark, and you just see the light in these display boxes. And you see hierarchical theorem that supposedly was 50 million years ago. And you see other ones, but ultimately to equus that supposedly came on the scene some 2 million years ago. So Dr. Colin Patterson says, we knew better than this in the 1930s. It's been here for 50 years. Well, I guess it's going to be there for another 50 years. But it's made out of imagination. This is the honors textbook of biology that Texas teaches out of, or did when my children were in high school. Now, I don't know if you realize this, probably you teachers do, that Texas has a lot of influence when it comes to textbooks. Our state board of education, they make decisions on which textbooks we are going to have in Texas. And because we're a big state and don't mind spending the money to research all these books, a lot of other states just accept whatever we suggest. So when my kids were in school, that was the book, and there you have it, Horse Evolution. Well, not that long ago, I borrowed the most current textbook from one of our biology teachers so I could look and see what was being taught. And there it is. You see a picture of the cover of the textbook being used today, and there's the horse evolution still being taught to our children as pretty much a fact. But it came out of imagination. I suggest that they're telling us, the evolutionists are telling us, that this is actually science fiction. And then when I was in college, we learned the theory of ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. It's called the biogenetic law. When I took comparative anatomy, it was interesting, in my college up at Nacogdoches, Stephen F. Austin State University, they are so steeped in evolution that nowadays, to get a biology degree, you have to take special courses just in evolution. But all of my biology courses had evolution heavy duty. And in comparative anatomy, and I'll just tell you this, I used to be an instructor of anatomy and physiology, human anatomy and physiology, at our local college. And most universities teach that what they prefer for medical and dental students is in their pre-med and pre-dental is to take human anatomy and physiology. It makes sense, doesn't it? Well, but not at Stephen F. Austin. They wanted you to have comparative anatomy. I'm going to show you what I think is the reason here in just a moment. So what they thought would be better for a physician or a dentist is for us to study the comparative anatomy of animals. So we were dissecting mud puppies, we were dissecting the spiny dogfish shark, and we were dissecting cats. Because twice a week, lecture was Monday and Wednesday, and then you had 2 days a week where in laboratory, we were being told this story, the biogenetic law, that ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. Now, these terms were coined by Ernst Haeckel in 1866 to describe his fraudulent theory that the embryonic development of the individual recapitulates through their evolutionary history by passing through the adult forms of their ancestors as they develop. Now, I'm going to just tell you right now, if evolution's true, I actually think this theory ought to be true. It's not true, neither one of them are, but I think if evolution were true, this really ought to be true. So here are the original pictures that Haeckel drew. Back in those days, you're not taking photographs of embryos. He was drawing them. He was a physician teaching embryology, and he was also a noted artist. And so he was drawing these embryos, and what he's saying is, you know how you start out in evolution, they say, with that single cell beginning? Well, there you are in the womb when you have fertilization and you're a single cell. Well, now you start out just like they say evolution started out, and then you have a number of other cells, and when you're a little further along as an embryo, you're recapitulating through that, and then you get to the stage where you look like a fish. You can see all the fish up there, can't you? And so they say you're just going through the fish stage, the reptile stage, and ultimately you get to the human stage. And so they say all these embryos recapitulate through their embryonic history. Yeah, still being told today. Now, it depends upon your professors, because I was in Tennessee a number of years ago, and I was eating lunch with Dr. and Mrs. Paul Douthit. Well, after a while, we became related because my son married their younger daughter. But I was in their living room where they had their formal dining room, and I said, you know, Paul, I'd taught about this. I said, I got this heavy duty. He said, I never even heard it. And when I was an undergrad, I said, well, good for your teachers. I said, but I bet it's in your textbooks. He said, I don't think so. But he went over there because his library from undergrad school was right there in the living room. He goes, he pulls a book out, opens up, and he says, you know what, you're right. It's right there. I said, well, bless your professors for not emphasizing that or teaching it to you. but it's being taught on almost all levels, starting down in high school. And so these are the embryos that they teach this theory from the book my children studied out of. But here's the truth. The beginning stages are what you see on the upper left of that diagram. The middle stages of embryos is what you see on the middle over to the right. And what Haeckel did was he redesigned the middle stages of embryonic development to look alike. And he labeled them as the first stages. Did you notice when I talked about Haeckel, I said it's a fraudulent theory? It was fraudulent from the beginning. He knew what he wanted to teach, and he made up the evidence to try to support what he was teaching. It was not based in truth at all. Now, you see again where he redesigned the embryos to pass on his fraud. Look at the top row. That's how he drew the embryos. But at the stage he's drawn them on the top row, the middle row is how they actually were. And they don't look much alike, do they? And then he shows how they're evolving into the ultimate adult forms that they were. Well, there's a few things you ought to know about Haeckel beyond what I've already told you. The theory of recapitulation was actually destroyed in 1921 by Professor Walter Garstein in a famous paper. And since then, no respectable biologist has ever used the theory of recapitulation because it was utterly unsound, created by a Nazi-like preacher named Haeckel. Over 100 years ago, this was proven to be a fraud. There's some places where you can find on the internet where they had a trial at his university and proved him to be a fraud. And since then, no respectable biologist has taught it. Still taught in our textbooks here in Texas, isn't it? Still taught in some universities. Notice what Keith Thompson wrote. Surely the biogenetic law is as dead as a doornail. It was finally exorcised from biology textbooks in the 50s. Not really. As a topic of serious theoretical inquiry, it was extinct in the 20s. It should have been taken out of the textbooks because we've known this to be a fraud for at least 100 years. Still taught in schools. Again, there's the book my children were taught out of, and here's the book that children are being taught out of today. Still talking about this biogenetic law and the homology of embryos. Now, why do you think it was so important for some universities to teach their pre-med, especially pre-med students, this theory? Because I'm going to just tell you right now, there are times when a young lady is considering having an abortion, and they go to an abortion clinic, and the abortion doctor will tell them, this is not human life yet. This embryo is still in the fish stage, so it's really not any more significant than taking a fish out of the water. I had a good friend that's a gospel preacher. He said, you know, when we catch a prize bass, sometimes we mount it up on the wall. If we're so proud of this, when are people going to start mounting these embryos up on the wall just saying they're in the fish stage? It'd be pretty embarrassing, wouldn't it? To me, it's embarrassing that our country is arguing over this today and people fighting for the right, not for women's rights, fighting for the right to take another human being's life. I think this is why this theory keeps being taught today. And you need to know it's science fiction. It's been science fiction for over 100 years. And so you young people, when you see this in your textbooks, just know that there's not any truth to this. Now, we mentioned the geologic time scale and how there are index fossils that are supposed to be key to certain levels in the fossil layers. And if you'll notice over on the right, pretty much all these index fossils from the very earliest all the way up are actually crustaceans. There are several huge problems with the evolution story, which is supposedly told by the geologic column. And I want to talk to you for a few moments about this. You see, that geologic column is supposed to be the history of the evolutionary tree. It's supposed to represent how life evolved from the original cell. And the fossil record is supposed to produce the proof. Well, here's problem number one. And if you're taking notes, just make you a number one. Problem is the data of the progression is not there. So whether you're looking at it from this evolutionary tree or you're looking at it as a geologic column, the evidence is not there. Professor Stephen Jay Gould, very famous evolutionist at Harvard University, now deceased, said the evolutionary trees that adorn our textbooks have data only at the tips and the nodes of their branches. The rest is inference, however reasonable, not the evidence of fossils. So when you're looking at the evolutionary tree, he says all you see is evidence out here at the tips. In other words, you see a horse, you see a frog, you see a human being. There are no transition forms from one to the other. Just didn't happen. Dr. Colin Patterson again said, I fully agree with your comments on the lack of evolutionary transitions in my book. If I knew of any fossil or living, I would certainly have included them. I'll lay it on the line. There is not one such fossil. Dr. Patterson says they don't exist. David Ropp said, in the years after Darwin, his advocates hoped to find predictable progressions. In fact, when you read Darwin's writings, he will say that this will all be proven eventually as they look more and more in the fossil record. In general, they have not been found. Yet the optimism has died hard and some pure fantasy has crept into the textbooks. So when you're looking at the geologic column, you're looking at that evolutionary biologic tree, these evolutionists say you're looking at fantasy. Dotton Batten wrote, we have arranged the groups in a traditional way with the simplest forms first and the progressively more complex forms following. This particular arrangement is arbitrary, and it depends upon what definition of complexity you wish to choose. We think of human beings as being the most complex organism on earth. And as a rule, and generally speaking, we are. However, there's certain things in which we actually don't have as much complexity as others. In fact, you just look at the trilobite fossil, and experts tell us the eyes that the trilobite had are very, very complex. We mentioned the other night the hearing of certain animals like dogs and the vision that eagles have. So when you're trying to figure out which is more complex, which one is more evolved, as they would say, then it's arbitrary. You just have to make up the story the way you want to tell it. W. Swinton of the British Museum of Natural History said the evolutionary origin of the bird is largely a matter of deduction. There is no fossil evidence of the stages through which the remarkable change from reptile to bird was achieved. You think about that. They tell us that birds came from reptiles, but there's no fossil evidence. That's just the way they've decided to tell the story. So, second problem you're going to see with that geologic column, the evolutionary tree, is the content of this column at the very lowest, earliest levels. Here we have this geologic column. And I have circled the very bottom layers, which are supposed to be the very earliest. What you have is the Cambrian, and right under that, the pre-Cambrian layer. That's where life supposedly began. So you don't have to remember all these layers. Just remember the Cambrian is right down there at the bottom. What about the content of these layers? You see books now talking about the Cambrian period, which was an explosion of life. Richard Dawkins, avid evolutionist, anti-creationist. He said, and we find many of them already in an advanced state of evolution the very first time they appear. It is as though they were just planted there without any evolutionary history. Needless to say, the appearance of sudden planting has delighted creationists. Dawkins says, when you look at the evidence, what do you see? You see what would support creation. It doesn't delight evolutionists, it delights creationists. And so he's honest enough to say that. Richard Monastersky said the remarkably complex forms of animals we see today suddenly appeared. This moment, right at the start of the Earth's Cambrian period. So you got this Cambrian period, and the most complex forms of animals are in that layer, and they're not necessarily even at the top of the layer, but at the start of the layer. It marks the evolutionary explosion that filled the seas with the Earth's first complex creature. This is Genesis material, gushed one researcher. When you look at the fossil record, what do you see? You see what supports the Genesis story, not evolution. Professor Gould again said the Cambrian explosion occurred in a geologic moment, and we have reason to think that all major anatomical designs may have made their evolutionary appearance at that time. Not only the phylum Chordata itself, but all of its major divisions. Now, when you look at taxonomy, which is the way biologists, especially because of evolutionary thought, organize everything, then you realize that we are in the phylum Chordata. The phylum Chordata is the phylum, the group of animals that has a backbone with a neural tube like we have. And he says, not only do you see representatives of the phylum Chordata in this Cambrian layer, you see all of its major divisions in that very earliest bottom layer in the geologic column. Does that get your attention? Professor Gould again said, since the so-called Cambrian explosion, no new phyla of animals have entered the fossil record. In Discovery, it said the large animal phyla of today were present already in the early Cambrian, and that they were as distinct from each other as they are today. There's a third problem with the geologic column. It's the process of fossilization itself. The process of fossilization, it indicates rapid catastrophe, not vast ages of time. You've heard it as well as I have. When you see a fossil, you think, well, it took a long time for this to be created. Think about that as I show you a few pictures and quotations. From Dunbar and Rogers, Principles of Stratigraphy, it says to some thoughtful stratigraphers, this amazing discovery of billions of years presented a dilemma. For if the known stratified rocks have been accumulating throughout this vast span of time, the average rate of dispositions must have been extremely slow. Yet there's very good evidence that the individual beds accumulated rapidly. What do you see? That's a fossil shrimp. Y'all are down here in shrimp country, here at the coast. When I first got to know my wife, Gayla, she was raised in Baytown, Texas. There were times where her dad would bring in a lot of shrimp. And we would devein those shrimp, and if they weren't boiled yet, we're going to boil them and we're going to get them ready to have a shrimp cocktail. But every once in a while, I would notice that somebody would overlook a shrimp or two. It'd be out on the counter. We'd go ahead and we'd have our lunch or our dinner, and then a couple hours later, you go back and you see what had been left on the countertop, and it was that shrimp. It didn't look so fresh anymore. You see, shrimp, they decompose in a hurry, and you know that because you live down here, and probably many of y'all have prepared shrimp. They decompose in a hurry. They don't lay around for long periods of time to cover them up and create a fossil. When you see something like this with details, you see evidence of rapid catastrophe. You know, it could be a local flood where layers just come in and cover it up, seal it up, pressurize it, and create a fossil. It could be the worldwide flood. In fact, I believe that a lot of the fossils we see today were created by the worldwide flood in Noah's time. That's why I mentioned before about going on that trip in the Grand Canyon. My grandson and I and others, we helicoptered down into the Grand Canyon for 3 days. We were on these J-rig boats going down the canyon and camping out at night under the stars. Dr. Tim Clary, PhD in geology from the Institute for Creation Research, would talk to us about these layers. In some places you can see what's called the great unconformity. Evolutionists and creationists call it that. Believed to be the original rock. And then on top of that, you see all of these layers. And Dr. Clary's been doing research all over the world. He sees that these layers are just pretty much uniform all over the world. You know, if these layers are laid down in isolation, maybe like in some area of North America, they wouldn't be the same as over in Africa and Europe and Asia. But yet everywhere he has gone so far, it seems like they're pretty much the same layers. It depicts the same event most likely, like the worldwide flood laying them down. Look at this. This is a fossil fern. You see evidence when you see a fern that's fresh, or it's fossilized when it's fresh. That's rapid catastrophe. When I was a youngster, we moved up to Portland, Oregon for 4 years, and the first house we lived in was right across from what we used to call the forest. It was a big vacant lot that had these huge fir trees, and under those there were these ferns. And I used to think these ferns were just beautiful. I was 7 years old, and I would go over there with a pocket knife, and I would cut down a fern or two, and I'd come back home. My mother would get out a vase, we'd put water in, and I'd put those ferns in there. And an hour or two later, I was so disappointed because it just took an hour or two, even in water, that the fronds on those ferns were just rolling up. You see, when you see this, you see a rapid process, a rapid catastrophe, like a flood, whether it's local or worldwide, creating these fossil ferns. You know, fossilized fish are so common that you can buy them in fossil stores. And they're not even that expensive because they're so incredibly common. You look at this fish and you see the details. And you see lots of fossilized fish. This is another sign of rapid catastrophe. Here is a fish fossilized in the process of swallowing another fish. It didn't take long, did it? And here you see another one. Same thing. This is common. And so when you see fossilization, don't think long, long periods of time. Something happened to fossilize these in a very quick amount of time. I put this there to remind me of when my son Reagan was a preschooler. The preschool went down to West Texas A&M to their Museum of Natural History. It happened to be dinosaur days. And I got to share this with you. I'm watching who I think was a graduate student teaching these kiddos how fossils form. Now they had a sandbox and they were actually cattle bones. But she would say, you know, here's what happens. If you're a paleontologist, you go looking for fossils and fossil bones. And you get to digging and you come across a bone. And you look at this and it's a dinosaur bone. Now how this happened is there'd be a dinosaur that would die. And over thousands and thousands of years, dirt would blow in and cover up the dinosaur and create a fossil. And then the paleontologist finds it many years later. I'm sitting in the back of the room and it's all I could do to contain myself. This is cowboy country in Houston, isn't it? And I live in cowboy country. In fact, I'll just tell you, within 200 miles of my house, if you draw a circle, a third of all the cattle in this country that are in feed yards are in that circle. We're cowboy country. Many days you catch me wearing boots and a hat. And I'm sitting there thinking some of my best buddies are ranchers. And I'm thinking, there's not a cowboy I've ever met that would believe that story. Seriously? The dinosaur dies and it takes thousands of years to cover it up and it becomes a fossil? You ever seen a cow die? Well, most of my friends are pretty good stewards of their ranch. But if you just leave that cow there dead, what would happen? You know, a cow would come over and he would gnaw off a leg and haul it over somewhere else so he didn't have to compete with anybody else eating that leg. And there'd be another predator do the same thing. And then there'd be the vultures come down and they'd start gnawing on it and eating on it. And if that didn't even happen, just pretend they weren't around, then the microorganisms would totally decompose that cow. It doesn't take very long for a cow to disappear. And it wouldn't take long for a dinosaur to disappear. So you see, people tell stories and they're kind of counting on you not thinking very much. And just go, oh yeah, that's cool. That's the way that happens. That's not the way it happens. When you see a fossil, think rapid catastrophe. There's some fossils that would fall into a tar pit, like the little break tar pits out in California. So it doesn't have to be a flood, it can be a tar pit. But it has to be something that is a rapid catastrophe. Look at this. A jellyfish is an animal that is just as close to nothing as you can possibly find. And yet, you know, we have fossil jellyfish. Fossil jellyfish. They don't have a lot of time to become a fossil. Rapid catastrophe. Well, here's a fourth huge problem for the evolutionists with the geologic column, and that is the polystrate fossils. Now, a polystrate fossil is a fossil in a fossil, or more particularly, a fossil in a fossil layer. And I can pretty much guarantee that when you were being taught the geologic column in school, they didn't draw all those fossilized trees and other fossils through one layer after another layer after another. In fact, I didn't even learn about this until I was out of college. Dunbar and Rogers, the principle of stratigraphy, said, the internal evidence in the strata, however, belies these estimates. And the coal measures of Nova Scotia, for example, the stumps and trunks of many trees are preserved standing upright as they grew, clearly having been buried before they had time to fall or rot away. Here sediment certainly accumulated to a depth of many feet within just a few years. When you look at what happened to Mount St. Helens in 1980, and the top blew off, Spirit Lake was down there at the foothill, and just thousands of trees ended up in Spirit Lake. Dr. Steve Austin, PhD and geologist, went scuba diving, and I heard him lecture about this and saw his pictures a number of years after this happened. And you know what you saw? You saw all these trees that had once been alive on the side of the mountain were down in the lake, and they were floating vertically with the root ball down. And they were being surrounded by all sorts of debris, including the bark. You got a rapid catastrophe like a flood. This may be a model. What you saw after Mount St. Helens was many, many layers of stratigraphy being laid down. And then this hot water came barreling through and created a canyon and cut through all those layers. It had been laid down so quickly, and it's kind of like a miniature Grand Canyon. And it looks like a pretty good model as to how the Grand Canyon most likely formed, with all those fossil layers, and then you see it cut through a canyon. Here's a picture of a polystrate fossil, a 30-foot fossil tree, one of hundreds found near Cookeville, Tennessee in the Kettles coal mines. Polystrate fossils present two major problems for the evolutionists. Number one, the age of the fossil strata, and then two, the method of formation. You see, the bottom half of that fossilized tree is covered in coal. the way I understand, the most modern theory of coal formation is you take about 11 feet of fresh green vegetation and you squash it down to about 1 foot of peat. And then you take about 7 to 8 feet of that peat and you squash, pressurize, and heat that down into 1 foot of coal. Now, obviously, a tree can't grow through that. And that process is not going to allow the growth of the tree, and the tree's not going to go in later. How did it happen? Had to be some catastrophe. Perhaps replanting the tree or laying down the coal and then the shale on top of that in a big hurry. And you can see pictures, you can get on the internet and see these polystrate fossils. They're especially in coal mines, and coal miners will tell you about them, and they're all over the world. So when you look at this evolutionary tree, I ask you a question. Is that out of evidence? Oh, it's science fiction. You have any questions about the evolutionary tree? Boy, I got one, and I kind of hinted to it the other day. When you go through all of this evolutionary change that they teach us, from the single cell beginning to more advanced life forms, you get to these animals that have exoskeletons. You know, insects and crustaceans. They have their skeleton on the outside. When you eat a crab, that skeleton, that shell is its skeleton. It's on the outside. When you squash a roach, that skeleton's on the outside. I haven't figured out how they think. You can go from a life form that has an exoskeleton to shedding that external skeleton and have an endoskeleton like you and I have. How do they make that transition? Is it logical? Is it with common sense? It just doesn't make sense. Evolutionists say dinosaurs evolved and became extinct 70 million years before man evolved. They tell the story a little bit differently. Some will say they started back in about 270 million years, and then by 70 million years later, some of them talk about how a big meteorite came and the explosion just killed the dinosaurs. But they say they pretty much became extinct about 70 million years ago. Yet, what does the Bible say? Animals of the air and of the sea were created on the 5th day, and land animals on the 6th day. That would pretty much put man living with the dinosaurs, wouldn't it? And are there any eyewitnesses of dinosaurs? I believe in the book of Job, you very likely may be seeing an eyewitness account. I talked the other night about how Job was being questioned by God in Job 38, the first 6 verses, and basically saying, hey, Job, can you answer why this is that and why this other thing is that way? And you notice in Job chapter 40, verse 15, he says, behold now behemoth, which I made as well as thee. Now, there are some translations that refer to it as a hippopotamus, and it's obvious from the text it is not a hippopotamus. What does he say? Verse 17, he moveth his tail like a cedar. You ever seen a hippopotamus tail? It's more like a switch. It's not like a cedar tree. This animal moves his tail like a cedar tree. His bones are as tubes of brass. His limbs are like bars of iron. He is the chief of the ways of God. Then you look at verse 23. Behold, if a river overflow, he trembleth not. He is confident, though a Jordan swell, even to his mouth. Shall any take him when he's on the watch? This looks like to me a massive animal. He is the chief of the ways of God. He's got a tail like a cedar tree. And when the Jordan River floods, and if you understand how the Jordan River could flood, it was just very deep. It looks like to me this is an animal that could stand in the middle of the Jordan River with its huge tail, and when it's flooding, he just raises his head up. And it looks like to me perhaps what is being described here is an apatosaurus, or maybe even a giganosaurus. That's what it sounds like to me. Keep that in mind as we look at just a few things. There's other evidence that man and dinosaurs and other animals that evolutionists say became extinct before man evolved actually coexisted with man. This iron hammer is in a small museum up near the Paluxy River. And I saw this iron hammer. And it's enclosed in rock that has fossils that date back to about 140 million years ago. That's when the dinosaurs theoretically were living, according to the evolutionists. But you look at this, and there's no way to get around the fact that it's a man-made hammer. It's got an iron shaft and a wooden handle. So it makes you wonder, was this made when the dinosaurs were living? And then you look at this, what appears to be fossilized footprints with trilobites. Now, you can look at different accounts of this, and I want to be very transparent about this. Nobody argues that these are trilobites. Some will argue that this is not a human footprint. I look at it, and it looks like to me very clearly a human footprint, but there's some scientists that say, no, it's not a human footprint. What it is just the way the shale was cleaved off, and it looks like a human footprint. Well, I'm not going to argue with you, but I think it's worth looking at and considering. And then in the Grand Canyon, the Havasupai area of that Grand Canyon, there are American pictographs where our Native Americans drew pictures. And you got to realize that the word dinosaur wasn't even coined until about 1841. It means a terrible lizard. And so you see other animals that we're familiar with on the walls that these American Indians drew. And with that you see this pictograph, this pteroglyph, and you have to wonder, is this a dinosaur? I'm not going to be hard and fast and say I know that it is, but it certainly makes you wonder, doesn't it? There's not a dinosaur story going on when they're making these drawings. And then up at the Paluxy River and some other places, there have been found some dinosaur footprints with human footprints. And there's been several of them in the Paluxy River area. Now, I want to be transparent with you. Many of these have been destroyed. People have been caught going in on this private property with crowbars and tearing up these human footprints, or what appears to be human footprints. I know scientists that are creationists that I have a lot of respect for that have questioned whether or not these are human footprints or perhaps a different kind of dinosaur footprint. Yeah, I'm not going to argue with that, but I think it's worth looking at and considering. And as you consider that, consider this. Evolutionists accept the discovery of soft tissue finds in dinosaur bones. And there is no doubt that we have found soft tissue in dinosaur bones. There's over 40 scientific peer-reviewed articles that I have in my computer now that show that there's no doubt about this. So you think about these bones. Let's say the dinosaur died at 70 million years ago, not 200 million years ago, like it's possible, according to the evolutionists, 70 million years ago. How in the world did soft tissue survive? You see these pictures that were taken from the soft tissue from inside the leg bone? Still elastic, collagen is found. Red blood cells. I read an account of this where one of the people that had this took it to a veterinary conference, and the veterinarian looked at that and said, there's red blood cells there. And he said, really? And he hadn't noticed that. And he looks at it again, and sure enough, red blood cells. How did they survive those millions of years? And then the bone building cells. Well, evolutionary scientists have had a hard time explaining this. They have come up with some theories that we've never really seen, I don't believe, how possibly this soft tissue could survive over 70 million years. But from what we know, highly unlikely. So is there evidence that dinosaurs coexisted with man? I believe there's an eyewitness account in that day 5 and 6, all animals were created. And perhaps Job 40 gives an eyewitness account. So with this thinking, why not theistic evolution? Well, it's scientifically wrong. I got some more lessons on this. We could just go on. But we're going to bring the scientific part to a close. And what we're going to do is we're going to say, you know what? It's also biblically wrong. The Bible will not allow it. And I want you to see why. The Bible and evolution are certainly in conflict. What about the order of creation? We looked at this, and I just want to review. In Genesis chapter 1, in day 1, the heavens, the earth, light, day and night were created. Day 2, the firmament. Day 3, the dry land and plant life. Day 4, the sun, moon, and the stars. Day 5, the water life and the birds of the air. And on day 6, the land animals and man were created. The woman made, not as an evolutionary process, but from man's rib. Evolution has it all in a different order. They have the sun and the stars before the earth. You got the Big Bang, and then the sun and the stars are evolving. And then they have the sun before the plants. God says, no, he did the plants on day 3, the sun on day 4. They have the sun as earth's first light. God said, no, I made light on day 1, didn't make the sun till day 4. They have marine life before land plants. God said, no. I made the land plants on day 3. I made the marine life on day 5. They have the insects before the fish. And if those are land insects, I believe when we're talking about land animals, that's day 6, and the fish are day 5. Land animals before the birds, that the birds are evolving from the reptiles. No, he said the land animals were on day 6, and the birds were on day 5. And they have both sexes of man, male and female, evolving from an ape-like ancestor. You see, you can come up with all these false theories like the day-age theory, the progressive creation theory, and it still has got the problem that it presents a different order than evolution. The Bible will not allow theistic evolution because the order of evolution is totally contrary to the biblical account. And also, the Bible will not allow theistic evolution because evolution is all about requiring trillions upon trillions of bad mutations, evolutionary failures, and dead ends to evolve a creation. When you take the time to read the Bible, in Genesis chapter 1 and verse 21, you see where he is creating the great whales and every living creature that moveth, which the waters brought forth abundantly after their kind, and every winged fowl after his kind. And God saw that it was good. God created animals, and it was good. Not bad, needing to be improved upon. No, it was good. Day 6, Genesis chapter 1, verses 24 and 5. And God said, let the earth bring forth the living creatures after his kind, cattle and creeping things, and beasts of the earth after his kind. And it was so. And God made the beasts of the earth after his kind, and the cattle after their kind, and everything that creepeth upon the earth after his kind. And God saw that it was good. God didn't use bad mutations to create and evolve a universe. And God did not use macroevolution nor microevolution. The Bible does not allow for vast periods of time to evolve a creation, whether it's theistic or atheistic. But he did it in 6 literal days. We saw how the evolutionists tells the story of the Big Bang happening 10 to 20 billion years ago, and ultimately coming up with modern man in the last 5 to 10,000 years and everything in between. That is just contrary to the Bible. And you can come up with these theories that we looked in detail at earlier in our study, the gap theory, the progressive creation theory, the day-age theory, the framework hypothesis theory. They're all used to try to reinterpret the plain scriptures, and yet God simply said that he made these things in 6 days. And he defines a day as an evening and morning, one day. Someone says, you mean 24-hour days? Yes. That's how Jesus defines it. In John chapter 11 and verse 9, Jesus answered, are there but not 12 hours in the day? Talking about daylight. If any man walk in the day, he stumbleth not, because he seeth the light of the world. Jesus defines a day. You got daylight is 12 and nightlight is another 12. And Exodus chapter 20, verses 8 through 11, when we see the 10 commandments being given, he says, in 6 days Jehovah made the heaven and the earth, the sea, and all that in them is, and rested the seventh day. Wherefore Jehovah blessed the Sabbath day, and he hallowed it. The days of creation, it's obvious, were the same days that they had in the wilderness. And with that said, you notice the word is plural, the word yamin in the Hebrew, and it's found 845 times, and it's always used literally. Never is there an exception. So theistic evolution is simply another version of evolution, which is a lie. They're both just a lie. So let me talk to you for just a moment about what a little lie can do. I know we don't think of it this way, but you realize when you poison a rodent, you're deceiving it. Because when you look at the rodent food in the poison, it is an extremely small component that's poison. Actually, it's a blood thinner. That's why they leave your home looking for water, because they're bleeding to death internally. So we deceive that rodent. We use good food, more than 99% good food, and just a little bit of poison. And so really, here's the deal. What difference does it make? It's just a matter of how much poison are you willing to take. How much poison are you going to let your children be fed? The theory of evolution has had a huge impact on society. I don't have a slide that shows this, but when I was referring to Haeckel as being a Nazi-like preacher, you do realize what the Nazis were doing. They were practicing survival of the fittest. They were taking races of people they didn't consider to be fit, the ones they didn't like. And it wasn't just the Jews, the Slavic people as well, and they were just having mass genocide. How could they justify all that? Well, it's these theories that these evolutionists had come up with, and Haeckel was one of them. We've seen this story in Time magazine about Is God Dead? And it was a follow-up to the 1965 article where theologians were trying to write God out of the field of theology. But then they were trying to figure out a way to make religion, God if you will, relevant when so many people had been convinced that God really is dead. There's always been two philosophies. Either God made the world or the world made itself. If God made the world, we were supposed to interact together in the principles of love, joy, and peace. But if Darwin is right, evolution is a product of survival of the fittest. And survival of the fittest is the idea that might makes right. Does might make right? I know you agree with me. Know what? But if it does, then you can just perform all sorts of crimes that you're strong enough and smart enough to commit and get away with. Evolution, that's about survival of the fittest, that might makes right. We saw Darwin's words basically saying if it feels good, do it. And then we also saw where Dahmer kidnapped 17 young men, committed rape and dismemberment and necrophilia and cannibalism, were all involved. And he said he did these things because he'd always been taught the theory of evolution and he believed it as truth. He later said, I now believe in Jesus. But at that point in time in his life, he did it, and he was just following up on what Darwin has said. If it feels good, do it. Now, it's beyond my imagination why anybody would think that's a good thing, to commit all these crimes. But you know, if there's not a God, what is crime? Whatever we vote to be crime? Whatever the leaders of the country say is crime? Because it wouldn't be based upon God. Evolution elevates the mind of man. It elevates what man wants to do. And all these problems you and I are seeing in our society, whether it's abortion or pornography or homosexuality or lawlessness, and you can name a lot of others, what is the foundation they're all based upon? Well, they're based upon this theory of evolution. There's really not a God. Barbara Reynolds wrote an article, pretty interesting article, and the title was, "Your Kids Go Ape in School?" Well, here is why. Because they're being taught evolution. She said in most schools, Johnetta and Johnny are being taught evolution, that humankind evolved from apes. So why do you wonder why they act like apes if we teach them they evolved from apes? We teach them they've evolved from earthworms. That's what's in our science textbooks that we teach them early on. Now, in 1957, the Soviets did something that just scared America to death. What they did is they put a launch, Sputnik, up into the sky, the first satellite into space. 2 years later, the world was celebrating the 100th anniversary of Darwin's book, Origin of Species. The American government, from my observation, seemed to say, you know, the Russians are ahead of us in science and technology, and they don't believe in God. They teach evolution. We've got to revamp how we're teaching science in school. So you see, before about 1961, there weren't that many words in textbooks devoted to the subject of evolution. Whereas by 1963, the average textbook had over 33,000 words really emphasizing the study of evolution. So you have to ask the question, how has this huge indoctrination with evolution affected our society since 1963? Teen STDs, way up. Teen premarital sex, way up. In most high schools, it's just expected that that's what's going to happen. In our high school, they talk about how the kids are out in the parking lot misbehaving on a regular, daily basis. Teen unwed pregnancies, hugely up. Unmarried couples cohabiting. I don't have to tell you the statistic on this, do I? People certainly did it when I was a youngster in the 50s and 60s, but it wasn't commonplace, and now it is actually the rule. I mean, the vast majority of people are doing this before they get married, and sometimes they never get married. And then teen suicide is way up. And you see more and more suicides, even those that are not teens. You know, if you get a terminal illness, or maybe you're just extremely depressed, and you don't believe there's an attorney to be concerned with, what's the conclusion? There's a simple way out. It's a terrible way out. Violent crime offenses. How far up? Up over 1,000% since about 1963. Well, it hasn't helped our society spiritually. Well, did it work in academics? You young people, you look at this. SAT scores since 1963 have gone way down. So when I was taking the SAT, it's different than it is now. We didn't want our children to get their self-confidence injured. So you know what they did with the SAT? They dumbed it down. It's terrible for a kid to take the SAT and not score as well as their parents did, so let's just make it easier. You see, all this huge evolutionary training did not help our academics. And then you got to see this. Time Magazine, January 31, 2000, had an article by Barbara Ehrenreich where she reviewed a book written by Randy Thornhill and Craig T. Palmer. And the book's title was A Natural History of Rape. They wrote, rape, according to evolutionary theorists Randy Thornhill and Craig T. Palmer, represents just another seed-spreading technique favored by natural selection. Sure, it's nasty, brutish, short on foreplay, but it gets the job done. Hence, rape is not an act of pathology, but a venerable old act or strategy for procreation. What isn't natural isn't always nice. Thornhill and Palmer's insistence that the rapist isn't a psychopath, just an ordinary fellow who's in touch with his inner caveman, leads to some dubious prescriptions. They want to institute formal training for boys in how to resist their natural sexual impulses to rape. That is horrendous. How old is that article? Boy, it goes way back. The very idea that it would be a natural impulse to rape and call it a venerable low act. That's a crime. It's a felony. In the Old Testament, that was a felony that would be the death penalty. Why is this subject so important? There's so many people in our country who believe in God, but they've accepted theistic evolution. Many religious leaders encourage the compromise. At the Smithsonian Institute, I took a picture of this sign where it's saying, oh, there's not a problem with evolution in religion. Many religionists have gone to accept it. So when we saw this magazine header where Time said, "Is God dead?" we say God's alive. And that's what we've been doing this week, and I'm so thankful you're here. We have shown strong proof for God. For the Bible is His Word. We have shown evidence that this world is not old like the evolutionists teach, but more like what the Bible teaches. We've shown strong evidence last night and tonight of science against evolution and how the Bible will not allow evolution, theistic or atheistic. What we believe is you honor creation. It's based upon the Word of God. God made it. And that's how we get family values and how we get values in every area, because our thinking in every area is the Bible, the Word of God. The Bible has authority, and that's why we talk about Bible authority in everything. John 8 verse 32 says, "The truth shall make you free." And the question that remains is, will you obey the gospel? Perhaps you've been here this week, and maybe tonight, and you're not ready to obey. You've got questions. Well, that's great. We want to answer those questions. And the good brethren here can help that. I'll do what I can to help answer your questions. But you may be here this evening and you're ready to obey the gospel. You don't want to put it off any longer. And so if you're ready to obey the gospel, we're ready to help you to become a Christian and dedicate your life to Jesus. I'd encourage you to do that if you're ready. So we're going to stand in just a moment, sing an invitation song. And if you're ready, we'd ask you to step out into either one of the aisles and come forward as we stand and sing that invitation song.